So first, tonight we're going to hear from our guest of honor, Isaac Saney, who is the former co-chair of the Canadian Network on Cuba. And he's the author of the highly acclaimed book, Cuba, A Revolution in Motion, which is being used by many universities. A professor, he holds a PhD in history from the School of Oriental and African Studies from the University of London in the UK. Isaac's teaching has encompassed courses on Africa, the Caribbean, Cuba, and Black Canadian history, and he is also an adjunct professor in history at St. Mary's University. His latest book, Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End, Africa's Children Return, examines the history and impressive dimensions of the Cuban Revolution's solidarity with Africa. We're very fortunate tonight to be able to hear Isaac's expertise on this subject matter, and we will hold a Q&A after when he's finished. So and enter your questions in the chat that you have for him as you're listening. So he's going to talk to us about Cuba's contribution to the struggle of African countries for their independence. So please take it away, Isaac.
Well, first, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for this honor. And of course, it's always powerful seeing Fidel Castro and other Cubans talk about, in passing, in some ways, their incredible and almost an unbelievable role in terms of solidarity with Africa, and of course, their solidarity across the world. Now, I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation here in Nova Scotia. And of course, Mi'kmaq Nation extends across not only Nova Scotia, but New Brunswick, parts of Quebec as well, and parts of Maine. And it's important to understand that while I'm going to be focusing here on Cuba's solidarity with Africa, it's important to also understand that Cuba's solidarity also extends to the indigenous peoples. Some of us may be aware of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and may not be aware that Cuba played a very significant role in shaping that declaration. The late Alfonso Martinez, who was a leading Cuban diplomat, played a central role in not only organizing and shaping for that, but also was honored here in Moncton, New Brunswick, at an assembly of the First Nations, where he had passed away, but his widow was posthumously awarded with an eagle feather, and he was honored, acknowledging not only his work in getting that declaration passed, but in Cuba's work with indigenous peoples across the Americas. My book, Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End, Africa's Children Return, is my attempt to basically tell in detail how Cuba contribution directly led to the immediate dissolution of the apartheid regime in South Africa. Now, the Cubans, and I've been told and having conversations with Fernando Gonzalez, the president of ECAP, and others Cubans, they produced numerous members, and I'll show you some of that in this PowerPoint. But because they have been building the revolution and continuing other solidarity activities, they haven't really produced a comprehensive history of their role in Africa, and particularly in the struggles in Southern Africa. In that movie that was shown in that snippets of the movie, in the Democracy Now! Piece, Fidel, the Untold Story, there's a section where Fidel says that Cuba's contribution to the anti-colonial national liberation struggles in Africa is one of the most brilliant pages that the Cuban Revolution wrote. And that story has not yet been written. So I begin my book actually with a story of how I met Fidel Castro for the first time, and how, in a sense, this struggle that Cuba engaged in to liberate Southern Africa played a central role in terms of guiding my research on terms of what Cuba was doing in terms of its internationalism. I was attending in 2002, in February of 2002, an annual conference called the International Conference on Problems of Globalization and Development that was taking place in Havana. It was being hosted through several iterations at that time, and Fidel Castro used to attend all the sessions. And organized by obviously various Cuban mass organizations, but particularly the Cuban Union of Economists played a central role in organizing this meeting. And they would invite various luminaries in the field of economics and political economy to come. Quite often people who were at ideological and theoretical, shall we say, loggerheads with Cuba. Some of these people were not socialists. Some of these people were clearly anti-socialists and died in the world capitalist and neoliberals, right? But they were invited to come, present their ideas, and have these ideas tested by debate in Cuba. So the first session of this conference, they had the Nobel Prize winners, Joseph Stiglitz give a presentation. And then later on, they had Ian Golding came on to speak. And Ian Golding at that time was an official in the World Bank. And in the course of his presentation in defending neoliberal economics and policies, he said, and it was because we insisted on these policies that we were able to liberate South Africa. That was a comment he made in passing. And a murmur went through the crowd. And this conference has been held in the Palacio de las Convenciones. Many of you have been there. It's a magnificent facility, which holds a few thousand people. So a murmur went through the crowd because there were many Cuban participants there. But Cubans would not challenge a guest in Cuba. I would not have seen proper. And it just happened that when the first session came up, the first question and answer session came up, I happened to be the first one who was asked to ask a question. I put my hand up. And I made the comment that while I really had an economic question for Joseph Stiglitz, Ian Golding, the representative from the World Bank, had made a comment that required historical and moral correction. And I mentioned that South Africa had been liberated by the struggle of its peoples, an international anti-apartheid mass movement, and but above all, by the blood shed by the sons and daughters of Cuba in the struggle to liberate Southern Africa. A massive applause went through the hall, not because I had said it so well, because Cubans could say it more eloquently, but because what Cuba had done had been acknowledged. There's a famous speech that Fidel Castro gives when he is in Harlem in 1995. This was to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the United Nations. And in this speech in Harlem at the Abyssinian Baptist Church, he's talked about how when Namibian independence was being acknowledged, when South Africa's move to democracy was being celebrated, there were all sorts of speeches given, right? As if it had been the work of the United Nations. But not one person mentioned Cuba. And so Cuba has been written out of this story, particularly in the dominant narratives and so forth. Yes, there were a few anti-apartheid scholars and activists who mentioned at the time particularly at the culmination of the Battle of Cuito Cuanavale, which I'll talk about, the central role that Cuba played. But for the most part, in the literature on South Africa, in the literature on the end of apartheid, Cuba's central role, a crucial role in accelerating the end of apartheid is often ignored. And so it was in the midst of that, after that applause at this conference, where Cubans, that in one of the sessions, when we had the pause in the session, the recess and so forth, that many Cubans came up to me, dozens of them, to thank me and to give me hugs for actually having said what I had said, because they realized that their role, this crucial role, had been ignored in basically the liberation of Southern Africa. And of course, I ended up meeting Fidel because of that, and he wanted to say thank you. And I'll actually show you a photo at the end of this where I am just completely, and not only completely befuddled, but in a state of awe, having met Fidel. The point about me writing my book, and I should mention here that I've written this book, which is perhaps the most detailed description of the Battle of Cuito Cuanavale you can find in the literature, as well as the most detailed description of specifically how the events in Angola, the defeat of South Africa and Angola, impacted on South Africa. While I've done this, I have to pay credit to Pero Glejeses. Pero Glejeses is a major scholar from Johns Hopkins University, who's written 2 books on Cuba's role in Africa. One is called Conflicting Missions, Cuba, Africa, and Havana, Cuba, Africa, it's called Cuba, Africa, 1959 to 1976. It's a magnificently researched book, and it's the book that decisively established that Cuba had intervened in Angola at the behest of the Angolan government and that the Soviet government had known nothing about it, and that the US government knew that, that Cuba had intervened independently, but was determined to continue to create and promulgate the story that Cuba had intervened as a puppet of the Soviet Union because it served US interest at that time. Cuba intervened independently, and Dalhousie wrote a powerful book that really detailed that. His second book, Visions of Freedom, Havana, Washington, and Pretoria, and Africa, which takes it from 1977 up until the independence of Namibia, is a very powerful book that looks at the dynamics, the interactions at the diplomatic level, and how Cuba's decisive role in Angola played a central role in pushing South Africa to negotiate Namibian independence. Where he stops off is where I actually take the story further. And I'll talk a bit about that as we go on. So this is the cover of my book. But one of the interesting points to talk about that sort of segues in from the Democracy Now! Presentation or video discussion that began this webinar is that there is, in a sense, a tremendous gap, a tremendous amnesia, a deliberate erasure, more precisely, of Cuba's role in Africa, okay, in the Western discourse, in the Western media. And so here we have, but in Africa, it's different. And here we have a magazine, which at the time was the largest circulating Pan-African magazine called The New African. It's now defunct. But it illustrates that among Africans, and particularly among Southern Africans, Cuba's role is valorized, right? And when Fidel Castro formally retired, stepped down from power in 2008, February of 2008, they published this edition of the magazine, Fidel Castro, Africa's Great Friend. Cuba is valorized in Africa. I encourage anyone that when the annual votes come up in the United Nations to condemn the US economic war against Cuba, the US blockade, these US sanctions against Cuba, one should listen to what the African representatives say, and also the Caribbean representatives. But the African representatives are so fulsome in their praise of Cuba, and they also highlight the role that Cuba played in the anti-colonial struggle, as is acknowledged here on the New African. What's also interesting is in the liberation literature of Southern Africa at the time, after the Battle of Cuito Cuanavale and in the immediate run-up to the dissolution of the apartheid regime. In the ANC publications, Chachaba Ubenzi, in other publications of other liberation organizations, Cuba's role is seen as central, and particularly the military defeat that Cuba played such a central role of the South African armed forces is seen as being central. So this says Cuito Cuanavale, turning point in Southern Africa, where the defeat of the South African forces at Cuito Cuanavale is seen as being a fundamental historical turning point in the struggle against the apartheid regime. And we'll chat about, I'll talk more in detail about that. So among Africans contemporarily in our current time, okay, and it was pointed out by Samantha, there's a monument in Freedom Park in South Africa in which the names of the 2,070 Cubans who died in Angola are recorded, okay, as well as, you know, there's a street named Fidel Castro Avenue, and people continually talk about and valorize the Cuban role. At Mandela's funeral, and this is the funeral program for Mandela's funeral, which was held. You see, when we go through the list of people who were speaking, we see that among the foreign leaders who were asked to speak, we have President Raul Castro Ruz. Now, what's interesting, there is various memoirs that come out of the Obama administration. And one memoir talks about on the plane ride of Obama to South Africa, and Obama gave, was it one of the foreign leaders to speak, one of the few foreign leaders to ask to be speaking, so many attended, that on the plane ride across, he was looking at the program, and it's sort of disingenuous, and he looks at the program and he says, you know, I see Raul Castro is asked to speak. And the memo talks about like he couldn't understand Nelson Mandela's peculiar affection for Fidel Castro. Of course, that's disingenuous. Someone like Obama would know that Cuba had played this very central role because there's so much declassified US documents that point to that. So Raul Castro was asked to deliver one of the central speeches at Mandela's funeral. And in fact, what's important, he was the last state leader who was asked to actually speak after, Barack Obama, Dilma Rousseff from Brazil, the representative from China, Leila Shaw, Hifikepunye Pohamba, who was then the president of Namibia, and Pranab Mukherjee from India, and then followed by Raul Castro gave the final statement of a foreign leader before the president of South Africa at that time, Jacob Zuma, spoke. So Raul Castro was given, and Cuba was given a very prominent position in Nelson Mandela's funeral. And people watching it live, obviously wondered why, because this history had been erased in Western consciousness, wondered why he had been given this particular role. And what's interesting is when Raul Castro was announced, and introduced to the crowd erupted in cheers, right? And in fact, he was introduced as the president of the country that had helped liberate us. So in Southern Africa, Cuba's role is not only known, it's valorized. Okay, and here's Raul Castro speaking. This is also where we had the famous meeting and handshake between Raul Castro and Obama. Turned out to have greater significance because at this time, the negotiations were going on, aided by the Vatican, also by the Canadian government at that time, which eventually led to the freeing of the final 5 Cuban heroes who had been imprisoned. Okay, now, the important point to understand about Cuba's link to the Southern African liberation struggles is, as was pointed out by Bill Fletcher in the video piece we saw, Cuba's support for African anti-colonial and national liberation struggles, right, goes back to the early 60s. First to the Algerians, where Cuba sent the contingent of doctors, and then they supported Amilcar Cabral in waging the struggle in Guinea-Bissau, and they developed a significant amount of connections with Southern Africa, with African liberation struggles. It's in Southern Africa, and particularly in Angola, where Cuba perhaps makes the most, and I think clearly makes the most significant contribution. Cuba had a relationship with the movement for the popular liberation of Angola since 1965. And and they had provided military trainers and so forth for the Angolan forces. When South Africa invaded Angola in October of 1975, there was a smaller incursion in August, but a major invasion in October of 1975, the Angolans issued an international SOS. And to the entire world that we have been invaded, our independence is in threat, and therefore we need assistance. They made a special request to Cuba because Cuba was seen as the country that could perhaps provide significant assistance. There were some Western African countries that did send some small contingents. Cuba sent 36,000 troops, and this contributed to not only preserving Angolan independence, right, by defeating the South Africans, but more importantly, inspired many of the Black South Africans who were involved in the struggle to actually believe that they could win. So one of the important things is the Soweto uprising that takes place on June 16th, 1976, when that uprising was taking place by youth who were challenging apartheid restrictions, particularly in education. Many of them marched with signs that said, if it happened in Angola, it can happen here. i.e., if the South Africans can be defeated in Angola, they can also be defeated here. And an important point to bear in mind, which is often ignored, is that when we talk about the struggle against the apartheid regime, we often speak about the struggles inside South Africa and the international anti-apartheid movement, the mass sanctions. What is forgotten is that this struggle was equally waged across Southern Africa. Hundreds of thousands of people died in the struggle to liberate South Africa from the vicious hold of apartheid outside of the borders of the Republic of South Africa. And people forget that. In fact, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission this is in the post-apartheid years, has a special volume, the second volume called the South African State Outside Its Borders, the Apartheid State Outside Its Borders. And it concludes that tens of thousands of more people died outside the borders of South Africa than died inside of South Africa in the struggle to liberate South Africa. So all of Southern Africa became an arena of struggle, arena of combat between those forces who were for apartheid and those forces who were against apartheid. South Africa was determined as the apartheid state to establish hegemony in the Southern African region, to create a series of buffer states that would protect it from the independence spirit that had raced across Africa beginning in the 50s and running into the 60s. And South Africa had seen Angola, and you see Angola in green in this map, as being a threat to its illegal occupation of Namibia. Namibia is that gray country between blue South Africa and green Angola. And so for the South Africans, their conception was in order for the apartheid state to survive, they had to have control of the region. And from 1975 to 1988, South Africa waged a war of terror. It's in the literature, it's called the War of Destabilization, okay, or South Africa's campaign of destabilization. From 1981 to 1988 alone, it is reckoned that in Southern Africa, over 800,000 people died as a direct result of South Africa's direct or indirect result of South Africa's aggressions in the region, and so on. And South Africa also adopted the idea that the regime, that it was facing a total onslaught. Okay, and therefore it adopted what was called a total strategy. We can, in a question and answer, I can go into greater detail. After the invasion of by the South Africans in Angola had been defeated, okay, we have the rise of P.W. Botha to the helm of power. And he militarizes the South African apartheid state. He raises something called the State Security Council above any sort of accountability to the South African Parliament and Cabinet. It becomes a sole decision maker. And he, as a former Minister of Defense, completely peoples this committee with military personnel. So South Africa becomes a militarized state at almost all levels, with the military calling the shots of the government. And what happens is, what Cuba does in defeating, particularly in 87, 88, the South African military in this climatic battle at Cuito Cuanavale, contributes to displacing the military from the apex of decision-making power to allow so-called reformers, if we may use that term, to come to the fore, who realize that apartheid is not viable and they will have to negotiate a solution to the end. So I'm going to go quickly here. So where I focus on, you can see this is Angola. You can see the Battle of Cuito, of this town of Cuito Cuanavale here. What actually happened was that Cuba obviously had dispatched troops in 1975, 36,000 troops. The South Africans were driven back. There was also an invasion from Zaire that was also driven back, CIA supported from that was CIA supported, that was also defeated, and the Cubans played a central role. But the biggest contribution was defeating the South Africans. When the South Africans retreated, I mean, there were articles that appeared in black South African newspapers talking about the fact that people now felt and were tasting the heady wine of liberation. And this was reflected in a number of Western publications and so forth. From 75 up until 1987, the South Africans supported a group called UNITA. UNITA was a group that had, it was one of the liberation struggles that split off from the MPLA, led by Jonas Savimbi, an incredibly charismatic and Machiavellian figure who was supported by the CIA in South Africa. And the South Africans used them as a proxy in Angola. And their goal was simply to basically have UNITA achieve enough control in southern Angola so they could declare southern Angola an independent country, okay? And that this would eventually lead to the disintegration of Angola as an independent state, okay? So Savimbi and UNITA was the South Africans proxy and supported by the CIA. Savimbi actually visited the White House under Reagan and actually received, Stinger missiles and all sorts of support and so forth. So he received a tremendous amount of support. And under the Reagan administration, it's important to understand, George Shultz, who was the Secretary of State, said to the South Africans that they were an outpost of Western civilization and the US stands fully behind them. US imperialism stands fully behind them. So UNITA was supported by the South Africans, and they were part of the civil war that waged in South Africa. The Cubans provided military advice, but never participated in any of the actions against UNITA. Their statement was that we were there to defend South Africa from, defend Angola from an external aggression from South Africa. What would happen, however, is the Angolans, the South Africans repeatedly launched incursions into Angola over various periods of time. The Angolan government would launch offensive to try and eliminate UNITA in the south. When they would be on the verge of victory, the South Africans would intervene to save UNITA, and this would lead to some disastrous results for the Angolan military. In 1987, the Soviet Union provided over $1 billion worth of military equipment to Angola. And this was in preparation for an Angolan offensive to eliminate UNITA in the south of Angola. A final offensive was going to be, it was named Operation October Salute, okay? Was the name in English translation, the Portuguese October Salute, because it was named because this was going to be the anniversary in 87 of the Russian Revolution, right? The 70th anniversary. So it was named October Salute. The Cubans disagreed with this offensive, and it's very well documented both in Cuban sources, in Soviet sources, and also in US sources. The Cubans disagreed. The Cubans said, you can defeat UNITA, but what will you do if the South Africans intervene, as they will? How will you deal with the South Africans? This will be disastrous. And the Cubans said they were against the assault, okay? And they said they washed their hands of the matter because the Angolans were following Soviet advice. The Angolans launched the offensive in August from Cuito Cuanavale as a staging area. They launched the offensive, and what happened was that they were on the verge of crushing UNITA. And South Africa at that time, because their policy depended so much on UNITA in Angola, that if UNITA was crushed, the South Africans would have lost their proxy and therefore their strategy. The South Africans decided to intervene, and the South Africans intervened, and there were thousands. This is where this is in Cuito Cuanavale. This is where major of the battle takes place. This is a contemporary photo of where a lot of the tank battles took place. It's called the Tupa Triangle, and so forth. What would they do if the South Africans intervened, right? Okay, and that was a major concern, right? Okay, what would happen if the South Africans intervened? When the South Africans intervened, they killed thousands upon thousands of Angolan soldiers. And the South Africans suddenly realized that while they had intervened to save UNITA, they had now inflicted such a damage on the elite Angolan brigades, which I go into detail in my book, that they could now deliver a mortal blow. So the initial plan was never to take Cuito Cuanavale, was never to actually engage in what was going to become a protracted struggle that happened in 87, 88. But they now realized an opportunity had fallen into their hands, and they began chasing the Angolan forces back to Cuito Cuanavale. And then they became fixated on crushing the Angolan forces at Cuito Cuanavale. What happened was the Angolans were now faced with an existential crisis. If they were defeated at Cuito Cuanavale, the road would be open to Luanda, and perhaps the entire Angolan government and its would disintegrate, and Angola as an independent country would disintegrate. It's at this moment that Agostinho Neto makes a special plea to Fidel Castro and to the Cuban government and tells them, okay, that we would like you to, we request your help to step in and save the situation. And just as in 1975, Cuba had made the decision to intervene and assist the Angolans on November 5th, 1975, and named the Operation Carlotta, which is named after enslaved African woman who had led a rebellion against slavery in Cuba in 1843. Just as on November 5th, they met on November 15th, 1987, the Politburo, and they made a decision, a critical decision, that they had to step in to save the Angolans. But not only had they had to step in, they were determined that they were going to end this issue of South African continued aggression once and for all. They were going to deploy a decisive force that was going to settle this question once and for all. And they also requested that they took over overall command of all the forces in southern Angola. The Angolans agreed. And Cuba's force eventually rose to over 50,000 troops. Over 900 tanks ended up being transported to Angola. Cuba sent some of its best planes, some of its best anti-aircraft defenses were sent, especially at a time when Cuba was facing increased hostility from Reagan. And then at Cuito Cuanavale, they came to the strategy that what they intended to do was to hold South Africa at Cuito Cuanavale, because South Africa had become obsessed with taking Cuito Cuanavale. And in my interviews, I interviewed South African soldiers, I interviewed South African generals who had actually planned it. I interviewed Major General Chris Therion, who sat on the State Security Council, was deputy head of the South African military intelligence and so forth. And he spoke about the decisions that were made. And you can go through the documents. They became obsessed with taking Cuito Cuanavale. And what the Cubans did was outmaneuver them. The Cubans held them at Cuito Cuanavale, and then on the west, they built up a concentration of forces that outflanked the South Africans and eventually encircled them, forcing them to retreat. Now, this is a picture here, and I've got some of these slides out of order for some reason, of Cuito Cuanavale as it stands today. In this particular area, this is overlooking what's called the Campo Triangle. The South Africans made 4 major attempts to take Cuito Cuanavale. I detail all of them, and each of them followed the same approach. And I asked them, why did you do this? I asked people. And it's because they believed that the only reason they failed was because of they were making mistakes. It could not be because of the fact that the Cubans and the Angolans were effective and could outbattle them. And this is the Campo Triangle where so many things were destroyed. I meant to show this slide earlier. I spoke about the war of terror that South Africa waged. This is probably one of the most notorious attacks. This is from the May 4th, 1978 attack at a refugee camp at Kasinga in Angola, where the South Africans attacked a Namibian refugee camp. This is one of the mass graves. Cuba is one of the only places where this is commemorated, right? Okay, this massacre. What's interesting is this, not only did the South Africans kill hundreds of people, and men, women, and children, okay, but they also kidnapped dozens of people as well, right? To interrogate, and obviously through torture and a variety of means. Major General Chris Therion, who I interviewed, actually participated as a captain in this raid, right? And was called Operation Overlord, and it was described by the South Africans as one of the most successful raids. Some of the children who survived ended up being educated in Cuba. Fidel Castro offered them free scholarships and so forth. It's another map of Cuito Cuanavale, where you see it's located. And this sort of gives you an idea in some of a graphic as a map of what happened. The Cubans held the Angolans, held the South Africans at Cuito Cuanavale, and then to the west of them, they developed a concentration of forces that astonished the South Africans. It was a complete major strategic coup. In declassified U.S. documents from the U.S. United States Intelligence Defense Agency, they have the Defense Department has its own intelligence agency. In the declassified documents, they talk about the South Africans being completely outmaneuvered, right, and completely suffering a strategic defeat in Angola. The Cubans gained air superiority, right? And the South Africans were eventually forced in 1988 to retreat into Namibia. Okay, these are one of the mass graves. I don't know why these PowerPoint slides got out of order, because they were in order when I brought them up. This is a mass grave of Angolan soldiers who were killed in 87, in August of 87. They were defeating UNITA, but when the South Africans intervened, they killed hundreds of thousands of them. And because the Angolan army, was not really a registered army, okay? These are bodies, these are mass graves of people whose names we will never know, right? Okay. In Cuito Cuanavale itself, where the South Africans made repeated attempts, you can actually go there and you can actually find, it's still a heavily mined area, but you can find tanks and remnants of the battle. The person standing with the glasses looking at the camera, that's Colonel Patrick Ricketts, known as Blas, a former member of the ANC armed wing. He's an interesting story. He was on 2 separate lists to be killed by the South African police, South African armed forces. He came when apartheid collapsed. He came back to South Africa as part of the new South African National Defense Forces, the reconstituted military of the now democratic South Africa, and he played a very central role. For example, in my research, as we traveled through South Africa together, interviewed people, collected documents. So one of the biggest debates was how many white South Africans died at Cuito Cuanavale. I talk about that in the book because I was able, through Colonel Ricketts' assistance, to get the complete list of all the South African soldiers who died in service, to confirm that South Africa was, as a white minority regime, had lost too many white South African soldiers. Okay, and in fact, it was becoming politically unpopular. Okay, if there are any questions, I'm more than willing to answer questions as we go on. These are some of the stuff you'll find in Cuito Cuanavale, some of the material, war material that still exists, the military equipment. You find, for example, this is the boot, the bottom of what's left of the sole of a boot of a South African soldier. Okay, you find helmets and so forth. These are what I was very happy to obtain. What I was able to do as well was to obtain the minutes of the highest liberations of the South African government. As I mentioned, South Africa under Botha had become a militarized regime from 1975 to 1988-89, a militarized regime. And all the decisions were taken at what was called a State Security Council, which had replaced cabinet, right? They produced minutes. And of course, these minutes, were produced in a small number and circulated to only a select group of people. And they're in Afrikaans. So I had to learn to read Afrikaans. These are minutes that talk about, this is from June and July, that talk about the military crisis that had now evolved from the South African perspective in Angola. And at this point, there's a discussion where Botha realizes, right, that if they fight in Angola, because they were worried that once the Cubans had basically established the military force in Angola and the South Africans had to retreat, there was a concern. Is Cuba going to advance into Namibia? Is it going to go through Namibia and then advance into South Africa? And it's important to understand that in 1976, when the South Africans had been decisively defeated in 1976, the Cubans contemplated going directly into Namibia and establishing Namibia's independence right there and then, and perhaps bringing down the apartheid regime in 1976. They didn't do that because the Soviets said they wouldn't support them because they were worried about the US intervening. So in 1988, the South Africans have been driven from Angola by the Cubans militarily. They're worried that Cuba is going to advance into Namibia. Okay, the Cubans would not let the Americans or the South Africans know one way or the other. Okay, but at this stage, because of the setbacks in Angola, the South Africans began to negotiate seriously over Namibian independence because Namibia had been illegally occupied by the South Africans and there'd been a liberation movement waging there. So when the Cubans, the 50,000 Cuban troops advanced on the Namibian border, okay, having outmaneuvered the South Africans, there were also 30,000 Angolan troops, and there was also a few thousand troops of the Southwest African People's Liberation Organization. The change of the military situation forces South Africans to finally acknowledge and accede to Namibian independence when they refused to do this, right? They could not fight in Namibia. They could not risk a war. And in these memoirs, in these minutes here, Botha is talking about that if we fight, we will lose too many men. We can't do that. And at one point, if anybody knows the story of the struggle against apartheid, at one point, the South Africans population had rendered the townships ungovernable, right? And now, instead of having police deployed in black townships, they were deploying the South African army. And at one point in these meetings, one of the generals says, we have two choices. He says, we can fight on the border, i.e., we can fight in Namibia and Angola, or we can fight inside South Africa, but we can't do both. We don't have the resources. And there's a famous speech that Fidel Castro gives in June at the meeting of the foreign ministers of the non-aligned movement. I think it's May or June when he gives that speech. I quote from it in the book. And he says, listen, we have scored a military victory, but we're not interested in military glory. We want this problem settled at the negotiation table because we now believe that South Africa is too weak to hold on to Namibia. And he also says, and this probably sets the stage for the final dissolution of the apartheid regime. So these are minutes right from the top level of the South African apartheid state decision-making that demonstrate that basically South Africa had suffered an incredible military setback that was having political consequences. This is an editorial from the Weekly Mail, which was a South African newspaper, the largest South African newspaper. This is an editorial campaign. And of course, in December of 88, we had the signing at the United Nations of the accords that eventually led to Namibian independence, where SWAPO, the liberation movement that South Africa had attempted to snuff out, actually became the governing party of Namibia. And this is a cartoon where you have Roloff Botha, no relation to Pik Botha, who was then the president, then the prime minister, then the president. Pik Botha was a South African foreign minister, and it basically says 30 years of conflict, and now I see the light at the end of the barrel, i.e. that it was Cuba's military intervention that had forced the South Africans to concede Namibia's independence. Okay. Also, within South Africa, I document the impact it had on Black South Africans. Black South Africans were inspired by the defeat. In fact, there was a huge documentary called La Represta a la Escalada, South Africa, the response to the South African escalation, which is a long Cuban documentary, over 9 hours long, and copies of that were smuggled into South Africa, and Black South Africans and people who are members of the anti-apartheid movements inside South Africa had secret watch parties, if we would call it, of that documentary. We also have a famous gathering, a meeting where Frank Chikani, the Reverend Frank Chikani, a very important anti-apartheid activist, talks about what the South African apartheid system, what colonization had done to the people of South Africa. And he talks about that. And at one point he says, and then there was Cuito Cuanavale. And the crowd erupted into rapturous applause. And also, I talk about the impact among white South Africans. I've talked about the deaths, right, of white soldiers. I mean, I went to graveyards. I interviewed mothers. I interviewed soldiers who fought there. And one of the important points, as I mentioned about mothers, was that mothers increasingly were against not their boys going there and dying in the bush war, right, as they saw, right, okay, and also being conscripted. And so this was a mass meeting of over 1,000 mothers, right, gathered in Cape Town, protesting against conscription. This is taken from the Cape's Time. And this is one example of the growing impact of the war on South African society, both in terms of in terms of invigorating the Black struggle, but also in basically shattering continuing white support for the war abroad, outside of the borders, and for the support of the apartheid system as well. I recommend that if you want to watch one of the best anti-war movies, there's a South African movie that was banned called The Stick, that was banned until the early 90s. And it actually is one of the best anti-war movies, and it details a South African contingent that is wiped out in Namibia, and then the South Africans send somebody to hunt down these SWAPO guerrillas. And what happens, you hear all of these, the feeling that people didn't know why they were fighting. They knew the war was lost, right? So it's a powerful anti-war movement that kind of reflects the feeling among white South Africans at that time. There was growing opposition to the war. There were poems, there were songs that were written that I talk about in the book. There was an anti-conscription campaign, people refusing to serve and so forth. That demonstrates that the war was having a significant impact in eroding the support for the apartheid system among white South Africans. Cuba as well, it's important to understand, okay, at the end of this, in December 1988, we have the signing of the Namibia Accords, okay, and with that, that guarantees Namibian independence, and it sets a timetable for Cuban troops to return to Cuba. And when the Cuban troops returned in Operation Tributo, Operacion Tributo, Cuba brought back the remains of every single Cuban who had died, right, okay, and there's a famous quote from an African elder that Cuba is the only country to come to Africa and gone away with nothing but the coffins of its sons and daughters who died in the struggle to liberate Africa. And these are pictures from Operation Tribute, an incredibly emotional time. But there's a very famous documentary called Después la Batalla, After the Battle, by Estela Bravo, where she interviews parents, right, who talk about, yes, they're deeply saddened by the loss of their son, right, okay, but they know that he died in the cause of fighting anti-colonialism, in the struggle against racism, and for the independence of a country. Okay, you can find numerous memoirs in Cuba itself. These are just some examples. I have dozens of them where people who participated in the wars have in the war there in Angola. Okay, from the very beginning up of the Cuba's Operation Carlota in 1975 to the end, and they write about their participation in those wars. And so these memoirs are a very important source as well. you also have South African memoirs. I've read all of them. I can get my hands on, right? The one on the right, The War for Africa, is actually the authorized apartheid defense forces, apartheid military's account, where these guys talk about what happened, and they acknowledge they were defeated. Okay, they acknowledge they were defeated and so forth. There's anti-colonial, there's other ones as well. And so part of the book is reading a multiplicity of sources at a multiplicity of levels, right? Okay, and all of them come to the conclusion, the evidence is overwhelming that South Africa was defeated in Angola, that it played a central role in Namibian independence. And then I go to demonstrate how the military was dislodged in South Africa. I think I make a very plausible argument that Cuito Cuanavale and the South African debacle in Cuito Cuanavale and then in Angola itself, and there was two other battles, set the stage for the military being dislodged from power and eventually leading to the end of apartheid. You can find, I talked about the South African Roll of Honor. You can actually go and find these are pictures when I was in South Africa from their memorial listing all the people who died in military service and so forth. I went to graves, unfortunately, okay, because sometimes it wouldn't appear in the memorial. You'd go to these private, because the South Africans tried to cover up how many people died, right? At the end of the story, we come back that one of the points I make, so in the book, my last chapter, talks about what Bill Fletcher says, is this unique solidarity and connection that Cuba has with Africa. It's a solidarity that comes from a history because of the transatlantic slave trade, right? It's a solidarity that comes from the fact that part of the formation of the Cuban nation, i.e., and the intellectual foundation for the struggles for independence comes not only from people such as Jose Marti and Felix Valera, but it also comes from people who, like Carlotta and others who engaged in liberation struggles as well. And of course, Atue, who was a cacique, right, who led the Taino resistance, right? So there's this profound connection of Cuba to Africa, where, you know, Cuba is part of the Caribbean, it's part of Latin America, but it's also part of Africa. It's a Pan-African actor. And Amilcar Cabral, the great liberation leader in Guinea-Bissau, one of the great African intellectuals of the 20th century, who led the struggle against Portuguese colonialism. In 1966, Cuba was providing assistance, right? And this is what he had to say: "I don't believe there's life after death, but if there is, we can be sure that the souls of our forefathers who were taken away to America to be slaves are rejoicing today to see their children reunited and working together to help us be independent and free." At other points, Fidel Castro would say, "Cuba is Africa," and we may dismiss this as rhetorical flourish, okay, as perhaps Machiavellian, some people might dismiss as Machiavellian manipulation at the highest levels of the Cuban government and so forth, to claim a higher purpose for their involvement in Africa. But when you interview Cubans at all levels of society, right, you can see there's this profound belief that there's this connection to Africa, and Cuba was playing a very important role in that. Now, a point I also make in the book that Bill Fletcher talks about is I also think that Cuba, in deploying its troops to Angola, right, also talked about Cuba defending not only Angola from the return of colonial domination, but also from the racist apartheid state, from white supremacy. And Fidel Castro often spoke about that. He spoke about the invincible white army being defeated by an army of blacks and mixed race people. But I think this also created a space in Cuba for Cuba to have a discussion about their own issues of race and racism in the island itself. It was a great silence for a variety of reasons, right? We can talk about, right? And yes, I would argue that Cuba has done more than any country in the history of the Americas to combat racial discrimination, racism. But as Fidel Castro acknowledged in 1986 in a speech before to the Third Congress of the Communist Party, it had not been eliminated. And Cuba then launched an affirmative action policy, which sort of sets the stage for the huge debate we have in Cuba now, and the fact that it's a commission, a national commission, led by Miguel Diaz-Canel, the current Cuban president, on the issue of racial discrimination in Cuba. The war played a role in opening up that space for discussion in Cuba as well. This is a picture from the conference that was hosted in 2013. You can see Julio Fonseca, the current co-chair of the CNC, behind Jorge Risquet, okay? And in the center of this photo is Jorge Risquet, who's now passed on, who was the leading diplomat in Cuba, a leading Cuban diplomat in Africa, my apologies, right? Leading diplomat who basically played such a central role. And when the negotiations were taking place, in which Cuba now became involved with the United States and South Africa over Namibia's independence, in which South Africa had refused to have the Cubans participate in these negotiations. This military setbacks and defeats in Angola that happened, now made it inevitable and unavoidable that the Cubans, together with the Angolans, United States, and South Africans, would participate in these negotiations. He was the Cuban representative there, Jorge Risket. And so we were honored in 2013 to have him at this conference, and he has been awarded here, a dream catcher, as well as some indigenous sacred artifacts as well. This is me. This is, I mentioned, I'd show a picture of me and Fidel. This is in 2002, and this is after I had made that comment, contradicting and challenging the World Bank official who had dismissed and completely eluded Cuba's contribution to South Africa's liberation. And what happened was, after this meeting, this is the only picture that survives. I ended up meeting Fidel twice. This was my first meeting. I was in the recess. I was grabbing a coffee in the Palacio, and one of the heads of the organizing committee came up to me and grabbed me by the hand and took me to meet Fidel. And I think there was about 15 to 20 minutes of conversation. And all I remember him saying is El Canadiense, giving me a hug. And I was just in complete awe, right? And this is when we're going back to take our seats in the convention center in the Palacio. And I am just dumbfounded, right? And so forth. And that's the original photo. You can see it's a little damage. And of course, I'd like to, this is Nelson Mandela and Fidel Castro. Some of the most poignant comments about Cuba's role in Africa were made by Nelson Mandela. And there's a famous quote that's often quoted by people. That's quite powerful. He says, the Cuban internationalists have made a contribution to African independence and freedom unparalleled for its selfless interests, right? At one point in his speech, he says, I wouldn't be free today if it wasn't because of Cuito Cuanavale. And that is a sentiment repeated not only by Nelson Mandela, but by other people at different levels of the South African government who were involved in different ways in the South African liberation struggle, right? So Cuba's story is really a story of unparalleled solidarity, because Cuba gained nothing out of those struggles. It was a commitment to defending a people, a country from racist and imperialist and racist aggression and white supremacist aggression. It's a blow against white supremacy, but it's also a valorization of African life. And I also document that despite the fact that now Cuba's solidarity is no longer in the military sphere, it continues in medical brigades and in education. And Cuba is the only country to have articulated on the world scale, okay, especially with the growing reparations movement, that humanity owes Africa a debt and so forth. And Cuba has made a contribution to doing that. Thank you, to paying that debt. Thank you.